The shift didn't announce itself with chaos. It arrived quietly, disguised as routine. By then, I had learned how to move through my days efficiently, almost mechanically. I knew which version of myself to present in which environment. I knew when to be warm, when to be distant, when to be silent. Adaptation had become instinct. What changed was the cost. I started waking up with a sense of heaviness I couldn't explain. Not sadness exactly, more like dread without a clear source. My body felt tense before my mind had time to catch up. I moved through mornings on autopilot, carefully assembling the image I would wear for the day. The relationship with him had settled into a pattern that looked stable from the outside. We argued less, not because things were better, but because I had learned which subjects were dangerous. I avoided them instinctively. He mistook my silence for agreement. Or maybe he understood it for what it was, and simply preferred it that way. I became financially more independent during this period, though not in the way I'd once imagined. Money flowed in irregularly, unpredictably, often tied to situations that made me feel both empowered and uneasy. I told myself it was temporary, strategic, a means to an end. I avoided thinking too far ahead. The environments I found myself in became increasingly detached from ordinary life, private spaces, conversations that never left the room, people who valued discretion above all else. Everything felt curated, controlled, insulated from consequences. It was intoxicating in a way I hadn't anticipated, and dangerous. I noticed how easily people projected fantasies onto me, how quickly they assumed access, familiarity, intimacy. I learned to manage those projections carefully, keeping emotional distance while maintaining presence. It was a delicate balance, and I became disturbingly good at it. He watched this transformation with a kind of detached pride. He spoke less now, intervened less. I had internalized his expectations. When he did comment, it was often framed as observation rather than instruction. He liked reminding me how far I'd come, how much stronger I was than before. Sometimes, late at night, I wondered if strength was really what I was building. My friendships continued to erode, calls went unanswered, messages stayed unread. I told myself I didn't have the energy to explain my life to people who wouldn't understand it anyway. In truth, I was afraid of the questions they might ask, afraid of hearing myself try to justify choices that felt increasingly fragile when spoken out loud. I became highly controlled in how I expressed emotion. Anger felt risky, sadness felt indulgent, vulnerability felt unsafe. I presented calm, confidence, competence, even to myself. The volatility with him resurfaced in subtler ways. Not arguments, but tests. Withholding affection, creating distance without explanation, watching how I reacted. I learned to minimize my responses, to appear unaffected even when I wasn't. I told myself this was maturity, but something inside me was tightening. I began to notice moments of dissociation, brief lapses where I felt disconnected from my surroundings, as if I were watching myself from a distance. Conversations blurred, faces felt unreal. My own voice sounded unfamiliar at times. I dismissed it as stress. Everyone was stressed after all. The idea of leaving him crossed my mind more often now, but it felt abstract, like imagining a different climate rather than a real place I could go. My life had become too intertwined, too compartmentalized. I didn't know how to extract myself without everything collapsing at once. He sensed this shift, I could tell. His demeanor changed slightly, growing colder, more evaluative. He reminded me, indirectly, of what I stood to lose. Stability, access. The life I had built around this dynamic. I didn't feel trapped in the traditional sense. I felt managed. And somewhere beneath all the rationalizations, beneath the confidence and composure, a quieter truth was forming. A realization I wasn't ready to name yet, that I had crossed into a version of life where autonomy looked like freedom, but felt increasingly like obligation. And once you notice that distinction, it becomes impossible to ignore. The realization didn't arrive fully formed. It crept in through small moments of resistance that I tried and failed to suppress. A hesitation before answering a message, a tightness in my chest when plans were made without my input, a growing resentment I felt ashamed to acknowledge. I started noticing how often my choices were framed as inevitabilities, how "this is just how things are" replaced actual discussion. When I questioned it, even gently, the response was always calm, almost amused, as if my discomfort were a phase I would eventually outgrow. That tone unsettled me more than anger ever could. I began keeping parts of myself deliberately unreachable. Small acts of defiance that looked like independence from the outside, but felt like survival on the inside, taking longer to respond, withholding enthusiasm, creating mental distance where physical distance wasn't possible. It helped, briefly, but control, once established, doesn't loosen easily. He noticed the shift, not immediately, but enough to respond with subtle recalibration. More attention, but conditional. More warmth, but unpredictable. Just enough to remind me of what I risked losing if I continued pulling away. The cycle tightened. Around this time, I started experiencing anxiety in unfamiliar ways. Not panic attacks, but a persistent unease that followed me everywhere. My thoughts raced constantly, scanning for threats that were rarely visible. I felt alert even when nothing was happening, like my nervous system had forgotten how to power down. I told myself this was the price of complexity, of living outside conventional boundaries, of being ahead of others who still believed in simpler versions of life. That story was comforting. It was also untrue. The more I tried to intellectualize what I was feeling, the more disconnected I became from it. I spoke about my life as if I were analyzing someone else's decisions, detached, rational, observant, anything but honest. I began to sense that my identity had fractured into roles. The composed woman in public, the strategic partner in private, the silent observer alone at night, questioning everything she had built. Those versions of me rarely spoke to each other. The cracks widened when something small went wrong. Not a catastrophe, just an unexpected complication that disrupted the careful order of things. A reminder that control was always provisional, always dependent on circumstances I didn't fully command. My reaction surprised me. Instead of adapting quickly, as I always had, I froze. For the first time, I couldn't immediately decide how to respond. The script failed me. The rules I had learned no longer applied cleanly. I felt exposed in a way I hadn't before. That moment terrified me, because it suggested something I had been avoiding for a long time, that the life I was living required constant vigilance to maintain, that it wasn't stable, only stabilized, and that the moment I stopped performing, everything I relied on could vanish. I didn't tell him about this realization. I didn't tell anyone. But once the thought existed, it lingered. And with it came a growing sense of urgency, not to leave, not yet, but to prepare, for something I couldn't fully see, for a reckoning I felt approaching, even if I didn't know its shape. I had crossed too many lines to pretend ignorance now. The question was no longer whether this life was sustainable. It was how much of myself I would lose before it finally collapsed. The consequences I had been bracing for didn't arrive as exposure. They arrived as pressure. External, undeniable, and impossible to rationalize away. It started with expectations that were no longer implied, but assumed. Schedules that were set without consultation. Invitations that felt less optional than before. I noticed how quickly my absence was questioned now, how any deviation from routine required explanation. What had once been framed as freedom was quietly redefined as availability. I told myself this was normal, that increased involvement naturally came with increased responsibility, that this was simply what growth looked like in unconventional spaces. But my body reacted differently. I began feeling restless in situations that once felt controlled. My heart rate spiked when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. I felt an irrational surge of relief when plans were cancelled, followed immediately by guilt for feeling it at all. I was no longer choosing my participation freely, I was negotiating it internally every time. The world around me became sharper, more transactional. Conversations moved faster, with less room for ambiguity. People assumed familiarity they hadn't earned, expectations they hadn't stated. I noticed how often my silence was interpreted as agreement, how rarely anyone paused to ask what I wanted. He seemed increasingly distant during this phase, not absent, but removed, watching rather than engaging. When I tried to talk about how overwhelmed I felt, he reframed it as pressure I should be grateful for, proof that I was valuable, in demand, respected. That logic disturbed me more than I admitted. I started feeling like a commodity, not in an obvious way, but in the subtle language of access and priority. Who got my time? Who expected a response? Who felt entitled to my attention? It was never explicit, which made it harder to resist. There was always plausible deniability. I learned how to say yes without committing, how to smile without connecting, how to exit conversations gracefully while promising nothing. These skills kept me afloat, but they also deepened the sense that I was living at a distance from myself. The imbalance with him grew more pronounced. He no longer needed to exert control directly. The environment did it for him. The expectations, the rhythm, the unspoken rules, all of it reinforced the same message. Stability depended on compliance. I noticed how rarely I laughed genuinely anymore, how often my reactions felt rehearsed. I performed warmth, interest, engagement, but the spontaneity was gone. Every interaction felt measured, strategic. At night, the doubts grew louder. I lay awake, questioning the meaning of consent when choices are shaped by pressure rather than force. I replayed conversations, wondering where I could have drawn firmer boundaries, where I had chosen ease over integrity. I told myself I was overthinking, that this was just part of operating in complex social ecosystems, that discomfort was inevitable when navigating power dynamics. Still, a quiet resistance began forming, not rebellion, not escape, awareness. I started noticing the patterns more clearly, how often generosity came with expectations, how kindness was used to smooth over imbalance, how quickly people withdrew warmth when I asserted even the smallest boundary. The realization was unsettling, because it meant the problem wasn't just him, it was the structure I had allowed myself to become part of, and once you see the structure, you can't unsee it. That awareness didn't free me immediately, but it did change how I moved, and how carefully I began to plan my next steps. The first open collision didn't look dramatic from the outside. No shouting, no ultimatums. Just a moment where my internal resistance finally reached the surface and refused to be smoothed over. It happened during a conversation that should have been simple. A request framed as an expectation, a plan discussed as if my agreement were already assumed. I hesitated, just briefly, and that hesitation changed the atmosphere immediately. The warmth cooled, the patience thinned. I noticed how quickly the tone shifted from collaborative to corrective, not angry, not overtly hostile, just firm in a way that made it clear deviation wasn't welcome. I felt the familiar pressure to adjust, to apologize, to make things easier by complying. This time I didn't. I didn't argue. I didn't explain myself extensively. I simply stated that I wasn't comfortable. The words felt small, almost fragile, but once they were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. The silence that followed was heavy. He looked at me differently then, Not surprised, more curious, as if assessing whether this resistance was temporary or something that needed to be managed. He reminded me, calmly, of how things worked, of how much trust had been built, of how expectations were part of any serious dynamic. I listened without interrupting, and for the first time, his words didn't settle the way they used to. Instead of doubt, I felt clarity. Uncomfortable, unsettling clarity. I saw how easily concern turned into pressure, how cooperation blurred into obligation, how my autonomy had been slowly redefined as something conditional. The conversation ended without resolution. That too was new. In the days that followed, the environment responded predictably. Less flexibility, subtle withdrawal of access, a sense that I was being quietly corrected through absence rather than confrontation. The message was clear: compliance restored comfort. I felt the pull to return to old patterns, to smooth things over, to reassure everyone that nothing had changed. That instinct was deeply ingrained. But something had shifted. I started noticing how exhausted I felt trying to maintain harmony at my own expense. How much energy went into anticipating reactions rather than making choices. How often I prioritized stability over self-respect. The cost had become impossible to ignore. I didn't leave, not yet. But I began to detach emotionally, to observe rather than absorb, to plan rather than react. I stopped volunteering explanations. I limited my availability. I practiced saying no in small, controlled ways. Each boundary came with consequences. Some people pulled away. Others tested me, pushing to see how firm the limits really were. A few respected the change, though their respect felt cautious, provisional. He became more distant, more guarded. The dynamic between us shifted into something colder, more strategic. The intensity that once felt intoxicating now felt oppressive. I no longer confused volatility with passion. At night, I reflected on the irony of it all. How empowerment had been sold to me as freedom from limits, when in reality it had become submission to unspoken rules. How independence had been framed as adaptability, even when that adaptability eroded my sense of self. I understood now that leaving wouldn't be a single act, it would be a process, a gradual disentangling from structures that benefited from my silence. That realization was both terrifying and relieving. Terrifying because it meant confronting loss, relieving because it meant there was an alternative to enduring. I wasn't free yet, but I was no longer unaware. And awareness, once gained, has a way of demanding movement, even when you're not ready for where it might lead.